My name is Rebecca Moore. I'm in my mid 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in rooms where decisions are made quietly, conference rooms, client meetings, long tables with polished surfaces where voices overlap, and certain people are always assumed to be in charge. I've never been the loudest person in those rooms. I've never tried to be. I'm a strategist by trade, a listener by nature, and someone who learned early that competence doesn't always announce itself. People usually describe me with words like steady, reliable, and calm. Sometimes they mean it as a compliment. Sometimes it's a way of explaining why they don't quite notice me until they need something done. I'm the person who prepares the deck, researches the client, and anticipates the questions before they're asked. And often, I'm the person others assume will be fine without recognition, without credit, without space. I've learned that being underestimated doesn't always look like open disrespect. More often, it looks like being spoken over gently, replaced politely, or thanked vaguely. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning an argument or humiliating someone who wronged me. It's about something quieter, and I think more familiar. It begins with a moment that sounds small when you say it out loud. My coworker took my seat during a client pitch and spoke for me. No shouting, no scene, just a chair moved, a voice stepping in, and everyone else accepting it as normal. What followed wasn't an explosion. It was a slow emotional journey. Confusion first, then self-doubt, then awareness. I spent a long time asking myself whether I was being too sensitive, whether this was just how work worked, and whether staying calm meant staying invisible. Along the way, I learned something that stayed with me. Disrespect doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it thanks you, sometimes it sits where you were meant to sit and speaks as if you aren't there. Over the course of this story, I'll walk you through how subtle patterns form, how roles are quietly assigned, and how silence can either erase you or protect you, depending on how you use it. There are no dramatic confrontations here, no sudden triumphs, just choices made carefully, consequences unfolding slowly, and a shift that happened long before anyone else realized something had changed. I'm telling this honestly without exaggeration because I think many of us have lived some version of it, not just at work, but in families, friendships, and relationships where being easy slowly turns into being unseen. This is a story about noticing that moment and deciding what to do with it. Before we go further, I want to ask you something gently, without pressure. Have you ever felt yourself disappearing in a room you worked hard to be in? Before anything went wrong, before I had language for what was happening, I needed you to understand who I was to them. Not who I believed I was, not who I actually was, but the version of me that existed in other people's minds. At work, I was dependable in a way that didn't disrupt anyone's hierarchy. I delivered results early. I filled gaps without being asked. When something broke, I fixed it quietly. When a client asked a difficult question, I already had the answer prepared, often in a document someone else would present. I wasn't ignored, that's important. I was acknowledged in passing, included in emails, thanked in meetings, but my presence functioned more like infrastructure than authorship. Necessary, assumed, rarely examined. People came to my desk with phrases like, "Can you sanity check this? You're really good at wording. Can you polish it? Do you mind taking notes? You capture things so clearly." Those requests sound harmless, even respectful, and at first I took pride in them. Being trusted felt like being valued. I told myself that influence didn't need to be loud, that recognition would come naturally, eventually, if the work was solid enough. But over time, I noticed a pattern I didn't yet know how to name. In meetings, when I spoke early, people nodded. When I spoke later, they summarized what I said as if it were a group realization. Sometimes someone else repeated my point minutes later, and the room responded as if hearing it for the first time. I told myself it was a coincidence, timing, group dynamics. I didn't interrupt, I didn't push, I adjusted. I became efficient with my words, shorter sentences, softer tone. I waited for pauses instead of creating them. And because I didn't fight for airtime, people assumed I didn't need it. That assumption hardened quietly. In client-facing work, roles matter more than titles. Who sits where, who speaks first, who closes, and without anyone explicitly deciding it, I was assigned a role that lived just outside the spotlight. I was the one behind the structure, not the face of it. When new team members joined, they learned the rhythm quickly. They learned who presented, who negotiated, and who reassured clients. and they learned by watching that I was someone you could lean on without worrying about ego. I smiled, I nodded, I helped them succeed. I didn't feel resentful. That's something people often expect at this point in the story. But the truth is, resentment requires clarity, and I didn't have that yet. What I had was a low-grade unease I couldn't justify, because nothing was technically wrong. No one insulted me. No one dismissed me outright. No one said I didn't belong. And yet, there was a subtle narrowing of space around me. When decisions were made, I was informed, not consulted. When credit was given, it was collective, never specific. When clients praised outcomes, their eyes landed elsewhere. I became the kind of person people spoke about with confidence, but rarely spoke to with curiosity. She's solid. She'll handle it. She doesn't need much. That last one stayed with me. She doesn't need much. What it really meant was, she won't ask. And because I didn't challenge that narrative, it calcified. Not because I was weak, but because I was consistent, predictable, safe. I was the calm in the room, the one who didn't make things complicated. And that calmness became the justification for overlooking me. Not maliciously, not consciously, just conveniently. This is the part of the story that's hardest to explain to people who haven't lived it. Because invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. It builds from small accommodations you make for others, until those accommodations are mistaken for your natural size. By the time anything overt happened, everyone already knew who I was supposed to be: reliable, capable, quiet. And quietly, without realizing it, I had helped teach them that version of me. The first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's why it stayed with me. It was an internal rehearsal for a client pitch. One of those meetings that sits in the calendar like a placeholder for something more serious. Same room we always used, same long table, same screen at the front. I arrived early, as I usually did, and took my seat near the center. Not the head of the table, but close enough to manage the flow of the presentation. I had built most of the pitch, not just the slides, but the logic behind them, the sequencing, the emotional pacing. I knew which points needed emphasis and which ones worked best if you let them land quietly. I had notes in my leather notebook, margins filled with reminders to pause, to ask a question here, to let the client speak there. People filtered in. Casual conversation, coffee cups were placed down, laptops opening. Then Mark walked in. Mark was newer than me, confident, well-liked, the kind of person who spoke easily, even when he wasn't saying anything particularly new. He glanced at the room, smiled, and without comment, pulled out the chair next to me. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he gestured toward my seat. "Mind if I sit here?" he said, already half moving. There were other open chairs, plenty of them. I hesitated, just long enough to register the question wasn't really a question. The room didn't pause. No one looked up, no one waited for my answer. So I stood, moved one seat down. He sat where I had been. It took less than 3 seconds. I told myself it didn't matter, that seating was arbitrary, that I was reading too much into it. We were all professionals, adults. This wasn't high school. The rehearsal started. Mark began walking through the deck. Not his deck, mine. At first, I assumed we were sharing the presentation, that he was warming up. But as he spoke, something subtle happened. He didn't reference me. He didn't ask me to jump in. And when he reached sections that required context, decisions I had made, trade-offs I had analyzed, he paraphrased, loosely, incorrectly in places. I opened my mouth once, closed it, opened it again. But the rhythm had been set. He was the voice. I was the confirmation. When someone asked a question, their eyes went to him. When I answered, they nodded politely and looked back to him for validation. I corrected a small detail. He laughed lightly. Right, exactly, he said, and continued. The meeting ended without comment, without acknowledgement, without anyone noticing anything had shifted. Except me. I walked back to my desk feeling oddly unsettled. Not angry, not humiliated, just diminished in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I replayed the moment in my head, searching for something concrete to object to. He had asked, I had moved, no one had stopped it. So what was the issue? That question haunted me because it turned inward. If nothing technically wrong had happened, then the discomfort must have been mine to manage. I told myself I should have spoken up. Or maybe I shouldn't have cared. I told myself I was being territorial about something that didn't belong to me. But later that afternoon, I opened my notebook and stared at the pages. My handwriting, my thinking, my work. And for the first time, I noticed how easily it had been taken over. Not stolen, not claimed aggressively, but absorbed. That's what made it a cut. Not deep, not dramatic, just sharp enough to register. No one else mentioned it. The day moved on, emails were sent, action items assigned. But something in me didn't reset. Because once you notice how easily your space can be occupied, you start noticing how often it already has been. After that first moment, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even name it to myself as disrespect. I filed it away under miscommunication and moved on, because that's what competent people do. They adapt, they don't linger on discomfort, they can't prove. And that's how normalization begins. The next few weeks unfolded without incident, at least on the surface. Meetings came and went, projects progressed. Mark continued to be friendly, collaborative, and easy to work with. No hostility, no tension. If anything, he seemed more comfortable around me, as if something had been settled. And maybe it had. In subsequent meetings, he naturally took the lead on updates related to my work. Not all of it, just the parts that were visible, the strategic framing, the client-facing language, the conclusions. I filled in the details when asked, which wasn't often. When I did speak, I noticed I prefaced my comments more. Just to add, this might be a small thing, but I'm not sure if this is relevant. Those qualifiers slipped in without permission. They softened my voice before anyone else could. I told myself I was being collaborative, supportive, that leadership wasn't about airtime. But something else was happening. The room began to orient around him, not because he demanded it, but because he occupied space without hesitation. And because I didn't reclaim the space I'd given up, people assumed the new arrangement was intentional. Once, during a client call, Mark summarized a recommendation I had written. He got the outcome right, but the reasoning wrong. It mattered. The distinction was subtle, but the implications weren't. I unmuted myself. Actually, I said, keeping my tone light, the reason we're suggesting that approach is… Mark jumped in smoothly. Yes, exactly, because of scalability concerns. It wasn't exactly, but no one questioned it. The client nodded. The call moved on. Afterward, I stared at my screen, heart beating faster than it should have. Not from anger, but from the effort of swallowing something I didn't yet know how to spit out. I rationalized again. He didn't mean to cut me off. It wasn't worth derailing the call. Correcting him would have made things awkward. And maybe that was true. But each time I made that calculation, something shifted internally. I was choosing ease over accuracy, harmony over authorship. What made it more confusing was that no one treated me poorly. People still came to me for help, still trusted my judgment, still relied on my work. In fact, the more invisible my voice became in group settings, the more indispensable I seemed behind the scenes. "You're so easy to work with," someone said once, smiling. I thanked them, but inside the word easy echoed uncomfortably. Because it is easy, I was learning, which often means uncontested. There was a moment, small but telling, when I realized how far the normalization had gone. We were preparing for a major client pitch, a real one this time. High stakes, senior leadership is involved. As the team gathered, someone asked, "Who's presenting the strategy section?" Without looking up, another voice answered, "Mark!" No one corrected them, not even me. I sat there, notes in front of me, recognizing the shape of the problem clearly for the first time. This wasn't about one seat or one meeting or one colleague. It was about a role I had quietly accepted. The reliable one, the support, the person whose ideas existed but whose voice was optional. And the most unsettling part? Everyone, including me, was acting as if this was normal. Disrespect, when it's loud, gives you something to push against. It creates friction, heat, and resistance. But this was something else. This was erosion. It happened slowly enough that I kept telling myself I could stop at any time, that I could speak up later, that the right moment would come. But deep down, I sensed a truth I wasn't ready to face yet. The longer you normalize being spoken over, the harder it becomes to remember what it felt like to be heard. Roles don't always come with titles. Sometimes they arrive as expectations so familiar no one remembers choosing them. By the time I became aware of mine, it was already reinforced from every angle. I was the one people relied on to make things work, not to decide what should be done. If something needed refining, pressure testing, or quietly rescuing at the last minute, it landed with me. And I delivered, consistently, cleanly, without complaint. That consistency became my signature. When leadership spoke about the team, They used words like execution and support in connection with my name. When they talked about vision, alignment, or direction, other names came up, not because I lacked those skills, but because I wasn't associated with asserting them. I had become a safe pair of hands. Once, during a performance review, a manager smiled warmly and said, "You're such a stabilizing presence. You don't need much guidance." I nodded, grateful. Later, I realized what that sentence really meant. We don't think about you unless something goes wrong. The role extended beyond meetings. I was looped into threads late, asked to sense check decisions already made. I was invited to join calls as backup, not as lead. When timelines tightened, my workload increased, but my visibility didn't. And because I handled it well, the system rewarded the behavior by repeating it. What made it harder was that I could see how the role served others. Mark, for example, didn't have to worry about depth. He could focus on delivery, confidence, and presence. He knew that if something unraveled beneath the surface, I would catch it, quietly, reliably. I don't believe he consciously thought, "Rebecca will clean this up for me." But he didn't have to think it. The pattern did the work for him. And I let it, not because I lacked courage, but because I believed in fairness, in merit, in the idea that good work eventually speaks for itself. I told myself that pushing for visibility felt political, that asking for credit would cheapen the work, that staying grounded, staying useful, staying professional would protect me. But there's a difference between humility and erasure. I started to feel it in small ways, a tightening in my chest when someone summarized my ideas as if they were communal, a hesitation before speaking, wondering if it was my place, a growing sense that I was always slightly out of frame. One afternoon, while preparing materials for another client pitch, I caught myself writing a note to Mark that explained my own reasoning in careful detail, almost as if I were justifying it. That stopped me. Why was I explaining myself to someone presenting my work? The answer was uncomfortable, because somewhere along the way, I had internalized the role others saw me in. The helper, the support, the person behind the scenes. And roles, once internalized, don't need enforcement. You enforce them yourself. I didn't speak less because others silenced me. I spoke less because I had learned it was expected. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me sad. Not for what others had taken, but for what I had slowly handed over in the name of being agreeable. Still, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand a new role. Instead, I started watching more closely. I paid attention to who was allowed to interrupt and who wasn't, who was deferred to, who was asked for opinions, and who was asked for execution. And as I observed, something else became clear. This role assignment wasn't personal. It was structural. The system rewarded those who occupied space confidently, and it leaned on those who didn't. And unless something shifted, I would remain exactly where I was, valuable, trusted, and invisible. That's when I realized the question wasn't whether I deserved more. It was whether I was willing to disrupt the role I had been assigned. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic line that changed everything. It happened on a Tuesday morning, in a room I'd been in 100 times before. We were meeting a potential client, large, cautious, the kind that listened more than they spoke. The pitch was important, but not flashy. Substance mattered more than charisma. And for once, I felt quietly confident. The strategy was solid. I knew the risks. I knew the answers. I arrived early, as usual, set my notebook on the table, took a seat that made sense for the flow of the conversation. Mark came in a few minutes later. He smiled, friendly as ever, and took the chair at the head of the table. I noticed, and this time I didn't move. Not out of defiance, not to make a point. I just stayed where I was. The meeting began. As Mark started speaking, something felt different, not externally, but internally. I wasn't bracing myself. I wasn't rehearsing how to jump in politely. I wasn't preparing to correct him gently if needed. I was listening. And as I listened, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted before. He didn't understand the strategy as deeply as I did. He understood the surface, the narrative, but not the trade-offs, the edge cases, the quiet assumptions holding it together. That realization didn't inflate my ego. It grounded me. When the client asked a question, directed to Mark, I answered it. Not quickly, not apologetically, just clearly. I didn't look at him first. I didn't ask permission with my tone. I spoke as someone who knew what she was talking about. There was a pause afterward, a small one, but it mattered. The client nodded. That makes sense, I said, looking at me. The conversation continued. Mark adjusted. He didn't interrupt me this time. He deferred just slightly when questions moved into territory he wasn't fully sure of. No one commented on it. No one announced a change. But inside me, something had shifted. I realized that my silence until now hadn't been strategic. It had been habitual, automatic, a reflex formed by repetition. And in that moment, I felt the difference between choosing silence and being silenced. Choosing silence feels calm, being silenced feels tight. For the rest of the meeting, I spoke when it mattered and stayed quiet when it didn't. Not because I was holding back, but because I didn't need to fill space to prove anything. When the meeting ended, the client thanked both of us. That had happened before, but this time they looked at me when they talked about clarity, about confidence. Back at my desk, I sat with the feeling. It wasn't a triumph, it wasn't vindication. It was alignment. For the first time in a long while, my internal sense of myself matched how I was showing up. And I realized how long I'd been operating out of alignment, shrinking slightly, consistently, to fit a role that had never been explicitly agreed upon. The shift wasn't about Mark, or the seat, or the meeting. It was about recognizing that waiting to be invited into space was a losing strategy. No one had taken anything from me that day. I hadn't taken anything back. I had simply stopped stepping aside preemptively. And once you experience that, once you feel what it's like to occupy your own position without apology, you can't unsee the cost of giving it up. That day didn't change how others treated me immediately, but it changed how I understood my choices. And that understanding made everything that followed inevitable. After that meeting, I didn't reinvent myself. There was no sudden confidence surge, no dramatic declaration of boundaries. From the outside, I looked the same: calm, measured, reliable. But internally, something fundamental had changed. I stopped using silence as a default. Instead, I treated it like a tool. In meetings, I listened more deliberately, not with the intention of disappearing, but with the intention of understanding where my voice would actually shift the outcome. When a point was already well covered, I stayed quiet. When a decision hinged on a nuance only I'd considered, I spoke, clearly, without cushioning my words. People noticed, though not in the way I expected. No one said, "You're speaking more." No one commented on a shift in dynamics. What they noticed was effectiveness. When I spoke, it landed, because it was no longer diluted by constant self-interruption or unnecessary politeness. I wasn't filling gaps, I was placing weight. At the same time, I stopped rescuing situations automatically. If a proposal was underdeveloped, I let that show. If someone presented an idea that lacked grounding, I asked questions instead of quietly fixing it later. Not to embarrass anyone, but to make the gaps visible in real time. This made some people uncomfortable. I could feel it in the slight pauses, the recalibrations. A few colleagues started preparing more carefully before meetings, Mark included. And still, no one accused me of being difficult, because I wasn't. I was precise. The most surprising part was how my strategic silence was interpreted. People assumed I was disengaged. When I didn't jump in to support a weak argument, some thought I agreed. When I didn't volunteer extra labor, others assumed I was busy with something more important. In a way, they were right. I was busy observing. I paid attention to who expected backup without asking, who took credit casually, who deferred when challenged, and who doubled down. I started documenting things, not in a dramatic way, just notes, dates, decisions, who said what and when. At first, it felt unnecessary, almost paranoid. But as patterns emerged, the value became clear. There was a quiet economy at work, of recognition, of opportunity, of trust. And I could see exactly how it moved. Mark, for example, began including me more often in planning discussions, not out of guilt, but because my absence had consequences. Without my automatic support, his confidence had to stand on its own. It didn't always. Still, I didn't confront him. I didn't announce boundaries. I let the system feel the difference. There's a misconception that power only comes from visibility. To reclaim space, you have to occupy more of it. But sometimes power comes from restraint, from not rushing to prove your value, from letting others sit with the results of their own assumptions. I was no longer silent because I was overlooked. I was silent because I was choosing not to intervene. And that distinction mattered. It changed how I walked into rooms. I no longer scanned faces for permission. I scanned the agenda for leverage. If my contribution would alter the direction, I would offer it. If it wouldn't, I saved it. Over time, people began to adjust, not consciously, but subtly. Questions started coming directly to me, not because I demanded them, but because I had become associated with clarity rather than compliance. And the more deliberate my silence became, the less it was mistaken for weakness. Still, there was something building beneath the surface. A realization that the system I was navigating wasn't just interpersonal, it was structural. And once you see structure clearly, you start seeing where it can shift. That was when preparation truly began. While everything on the surface seemed steady, something else was happening underneath, and no one was paying attention. Because preparation, when done quietly, rarely announces itself. I didn't change my schedule. I didn't start staying late or arriving earlier than usual. From the outside, my work looked consistent, even unremarkable. But the way I engaged with it had shifted completely. I began mapping influence, not in a manipulative sense, but in a practical one. I paid attention to where decisions actually came from, not where they were discussed, but where they were finalized. Who had informal access to leadership? Which clients trusted which voices? Whose opinions carried weight when no one was performing? And I noticed something important. Many of the strongest client relationships didn't belong to the people who spoke the most. They belonged to the people who listened carefully, followed through, and remembered details that mattered. People like me. Clients emailed me directly, not because I was the lead, but because I was responsive, accurate, thoughtful. They asked clarifying questions, shared concerns they didn't raise in group calls. I started treating those moments differently. I didn't forward everything immediately. I didn't loop others in reflexively. I responded fully, professionally, and documented the exchange. I wasn't hoarding information. I was recognizing responsibility. At the same time, I deepened my understanding of the business beyond my immediate role. Financials, contract structures, client retention metrics, things no one had ever told me not to look at, because no one had ever imagined I would. Knowledge creates optionality, and optionality creates leverage. I also noticed how fragile some of the confidence around me actually was. Presentations that sounded polished but weren't grounded. Decisions are made for optics rather than outcomes. Risks quietly transferred to people like me, who were expected to absorb them without complaint. I stopped absorbing them. Instead, I asked clarifying questions early, in writing, with stakeholders CC'd. Nothing confrontational, just precise. Can you confirm ownership on this? Which assumption are we validating here? If this shifts, who's accountable for the outcome? Those questions changed things, not because they accused anyone, but because they made invisible dynamics visible. And while no one commented on it, I could feel the room recalibrate. The most important preparation, though, was internal. I let go of the need to be liked. Not in a dramatic way, I didn't become cold or distant. I just stopped measuring my worth by how smooth interactions felt. I accepted that clarity can cause discomfort, and that discomfort isn't damage. This was something I'd never allowed myself before. I had equated calm with goodness, ease with professionalism. Now I understand the difference between peace and avoidance. Mark, meanwhile, continued as before, confident, personable, unaware. He didn't notice that I no longer prepped him before meetings unless he asked. I no longer catch small errors privately. I no longer fill in gaps automatically. And because nothing had gone wrong yet, he assumed everything was fine. That's the danger of quiet shifts. They don't trigger alarms. By the time anyone realized how much I had been carrying, it was already too late to pretend it hadn't mattered. I wasn't plotting an outcome. I wasn't waiting for a moment to strike. I was preparing for inevitability. Because when systems rely on unacknowledged labor, they eventually reveal their fault lines. And I wanted to know exactly where those lines were before I needed to act. The irony is that all of this preparation made me calmer, not more tense. I slept better. I stopped replaying meetings in my head. I felt grounded in a way I hadn't in years. Not because I had power, but because I had awareness. And awareness, once gained, doesn't go away. It sharpens. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where I leaned back in my chair and thought, I've got them. It came quietly in the form of clarity. By this point, I had been documenting patterns for months. Not obsessively, just consistently. Notes from meetings, follow-ups with clients, versions of documents, small decisions that, taken alone, meant nothing, but together told a story. One afternoon, while reviewing a client account in preparation for a quarterly review, I noticed something that made me pause. The client's renewal timeline didn't match the internal projections. At first, I assumed it was a clerical error, but as I traced the numbers back, emails, assumptions, meeting notes, I realized the discrepancy wasn't accidental. It was structural. The client's confidence wasn't tied to the pitch or the presenters. It was tied to continuity, specifically me. I was the one they emailed when they had concerns, the one who remembered past constraints, the one who followed through after the meetings ended. They trusted the work because they trusted the process, and I was the most consistent part of that process. That realization sat with me longer than I expected, not because it felt empowering, but because it felt sobering. If I was this central to the stability of the account, why was my role still framed as secondary? The answer wasn't flattering to anyone. I looked deeper. I reviewed similar accounts, similar patterns, different faces presenting, but the same names showing up in client correspondence, problem resolution, and strategic memory. Mine. This wasn't about ego, it was about risk. The organization believed it had redundancy. That work would continue smoothly no matter who was visible. But that belief rested on a false assumption that invisible labor was interchangeable. It wasn't. And once I saw that clearly, I stopped feeling conflicted. There was no excitement in this realization, no satisfaction, just responsibility, because leverage, when discovered, doesn't feel like power. It feels like weight. I didn't share this insight with anyone. Not with leadership, not with Mark. I didn't adjust my behavior suddenly. I didn't signal anything had changed. I simply became more deliberate. I clarified the scopes, confirmed ownership, documented dependencies, not to expose anyone, but to ensure accuracy. And in doing so, I could see how precarious certain dynamics actually were. Mark wasn't incompetent. That mattered. This wasn't a story of someone failing upward. He was capable, confident, and well regarded. But his confidence rested on an assumption that someone else was holding the connective tissue together. Someone had been me. The private reveal wasn't that I could disrupt things. It was that I didn't need to. If I changed nothing except my availability, if I simply operated within the boundaries of my actual role, instead of the expanded one I'd been quietly performing, the system would feel it. That knowledge didn't make me smile. It made me careful. Because the moment you realize you matter more than you're acknowledged, you face a choice. You can demand recognition loudly, or you can let reality assert itself. And I wasn't interested in drama. I wasn't interested in teaching anyone a lesson. I was interested in alignment between responsibility and authority, between contribution and voice. So I kept this knowledge to myself. I let it settle. I let it mature. Because timing matters. And the next choice I made would be irreversible. Not because it was aggressive, but because it was honest. Once you understand your leverage, indecision becomes its own kind of action. I didn't rush the next step. In fact, I slowed down. I wanted to be sure that whatever I chose wasn't a reaction, but a direction. There were several paths open to me, and I considered each one carefully. I could have requested a formal role change, asked for a new title, more visibility, a clearer mandate. That would have been reasonable, safe, the kind of move people respect on paper. But I knew how that story usually goes. A conversation, a nod, promises to loop me in more. Small adjustments that fade once the immediate pressure passes. The structure remains intact, just repainted. I could have confronted Mark directly, told him how the seat, the interruptions, the pattern had affected me. He probably would have listened. He might even have apologized. But an apology wouldn't change the system that allowed it to happen. And I didn't want acknowledgement. I wanted coherence. I could have stayed exactly where I was, continue performing the expanded role, keep things running smoothly, accept the trade-off. Many people do. It's comfortable, predictable. But I had already crossed a line internally. I could no longer pretend I didn't see the cost. Every option had a consequence. Some were visible, some weren't. What I asked myself instead was a different question. What choice lets me remain honest with myself 6 months from now? The answer wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, and it scared me a little. I decided to stop operating beyond my defined role. Not abruptly, not punitively. Just accurately, I would do my job, fully, thoughtfully, with integrity. But I would no longer compensate for structural gaps that weren't mine to carry. That meant fewer just checking in messages. Fewer pre-meeting briefs are sent unasked. Fewer late-night fixes that smoothed over someone else's oversight. It meant letting work be seen for what it was, complete or incomplete, without my invisible hand correcting it. This wasn't withdrawal, it was alignment. And it was irreversible, because once you stop overfunctioning, you can't convincingly return to pretending it's effortless. I was aware that this choice would create friction. Not immediately, but eventually. People had grown used to a certain level of stability, And stability, when it's disrupted, reveals dependency. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't explain it. I just began living inside it. When someone asked me to take on extra responsibility without authority, I asked clarifying questions instead of saying yes. When timelines were unrealistic, I said so early. When decisions were made without my input, I accepted that and didn't quietly correct them later. This felt uncomfortable at first, like I was letting standards slip. But I realized something important. Standards that only exist because one person is compensating are not standards. They're habits. The real decision wasn't about asserting myself. It was about whether I trusted reality enough to let it speak. And I did, because if my contribution truly mattered, as the evidence suggested, then removing the excess should reveal that truth more clearly than any conversation ever could. That was the moment I stopped asking what others would think and started asking what the system would do. Nothing dramatic happened at first. That was the strangest part. I made my adjustments quietly, almost invisibly. I didn't change my demeanor. I didn't become distant or cold. I was still responsive, still professional, still committed to doing good work. I just stopped doing extra work that hid structural weaknesses. When a deck came together without a clear strategic through line, I didn't rebuild it after hours. I flagged the issue during working time and asked for direction. When ownership was unclear, I didn't assume it. I asked for it to be assigned. When a client emailed with a question that technically fell outside my scope, I answered what I could and looped in the appropriate owner instead of resolving it myself. From the outside, this looked like maturity, like focus. Inside the system, it began to register as an absence. Not immediately, but gradually. Mark started asking more questions in meetings, hesitating where he hadn't before. He prepared more carefully, which was a good thing, but it also slowed him down. Deadlines slipped by a day here, a day there. Nothing alarming, just enough to create a low-level tension. Leadership noticed the friction before they noticed me. There were side conversations. What's changed? No one said my name. That was fine, because this phase wasn't about being seen. It was about letting cause and effect reconnect. For a long time, outcomes had been decoupled from behavior. Work appeared seamless because I had absorbed the seams. Now, the seams were visible again. And still, I didn't intervene. I watched. I noted who scrambled and who adapted, who took responsibility and who deflected, who asked thoughtful questions and who blamed the process. This observation wasn't passive, it was data. I was learning how resilient the system actually was, without me quietly reinforcing it. At the same time, I continued to do my job well. I met my commitments, I communicated clearly, I documented decisions. That distinction mattered. This wasn't sabotage, it was accurate. When leadership finally scheduled a check-in about resourcing concerns, I listened more than I spoke. They talked about pressure, about complexity, about how things felt heavier lately. I nodded, asked clarifying questions, offered specific observations, without positioning myself as the solution. I didn't say, I used to handle that. I said, here's where the bottleneck seems to be. They thanked me for my insight. Nothing changed immediately, but something shifted, because now the system was beginning to feel the absence of an invisible stabilizer, and it didn't know how to name it. That's what moving in silence looks like. It's not about secrecy, it's about restraint, about letting dynamics surface on their own terms without forcing a narrative. By the time anyone realized what had been holding things together, the consequences were already in motion. And those consequences didn't need me to escalate them. They were already unfolding. Consequences rarely arrive as punishment. More often, they arrive in confusion. That's how it started. Small questions surfaced in meetings, questions that used to have quiet answers before they were ever asked, clarifications that are now needed in time, follow-ups that multiply instead of resolving. Nothing broke, nothing failed outright, but momentum slowed. People felt it before they understood it. A client asked for clarification that no one could immediately provide, not because the information didn't exist, but because it lived in context, not in slides. And that context had always been carried informally, conversationally. By me, another client delayed a decision. Not out of dissatisfaction, but uncertainty. They wanted reassurance, continuity, someone who remembered why certain constraints had been set months ago. Leadership noticed the hesitation. Mark noticed the hesitation. I noticed something else. People were working harder, but with less confidence. They double-checked things, asked for approvals more often, looping in more stakeholders, just in case. The system was compensating for the absence of something it hadn't realized it depended on. And still, no one blamed anyone. That's what made it so revealing. When systems are truly resilient, the absence of one person doesn't register. Work redistributes, knowledge transfers. But this system had relied on silent continuity, and now that continuity was operating strictly within scope. I received more messages framed as questions than requests. Do you have context on this? Can you remind me why we chose that approach? Wasn't there a concern about this earlier? I answered what I could, accurately, concisely. And when something fell outside my role, I said so. Not defensively, just clearly. I'm not the owner of that, but I can point you to where the decision was made. This frustrated some people, not because I was unhelpful, but because they were encountering boundaries they hadn't known existed. Mark began to feel it more directly. In one meeting, a senior stakeholder asked a question he couldn't answer. He glanced at me reflexively. I met his eyes and waited, not out of spite, out of truth. He answered as best he could. The response was acceptable, but incomplete. The stakeholder nodded slowly. We'll need to revisit that, they said. Afterward, Mark approached me. You probably had more context there, he said, not accusingly, almost uncertain. I did, I replied, but it wasn't something I'd been looped into on this iteration. That was it. No argument, no tension, just a statement of fact. And facts, when spoken calmly, are difficult to contest. From that point on, people started paying closer attention to where information lived. Who held it? Who didn't? They began inviting me earlier into discussions, not because I demanded it, but because the cost of not doing so had become visible. The irony wasn't lost on me. Nothing I was experiencing now was new. It was simply no longer hidden. The work had always required this level of thoughtfulness, this level of continuity. The difference was that it was no longer being provided invisibly. And that visibility, unintentional as it was, changed the equation. People weren't angry. They were unsettled, because something they had taken for granted was no longer quietly cushioning outcomes. And once that cushion is gone, the system has to either adapt or acknowledge what it lost. By the time leadership recognized there was a problem, they still didn't understand what it was. That's often how it goes. They saw symptoms, missed nuances, slower decisions, clients asking for reassurance, but they treated them as isolated issues, process problems, communication gaps, things that could be patched with another meeting, another framework, another check-in. They didn't see the common thread. Not yet. I was invited into a series of conversations framed around optimization, how to streamline, how to improve handoffs, how to reduce dependency on individuals. The irony was quiet but sharp. For years, the system had depended on me precisely because it didn't acknowledge dependency. Now that I was operating within clear boundaries, I wanted to fix the absence without naming it. I listened. I contributed thoughtfully. I suggested documentation, clearer ownership, and earlier involvement of the right stakeholders. All reasonable, all helpful, but none of it recreated what had been lost. Because what had been lost wasn't just information. It was a trust built over time, context carried across months, the ability to sense when something was off before it became visible. Those things don't transfer instantly. Mark felt the pressure more acutely now. He started looping me into meetings earlier, asking for input more directly, offering me space to speak. And for a moment, I considered whether this was enough, whether I should step back into the expanded role I'd vacated, now with acknowledgement. But something stopped me, because the offers were reactive. They came from urgency, not understanding. And urgency fades. I realized that if I stepped back in now, the system would stabilize, but the structure would remain unchanged. My expanded role would be normalized again, this time with a polite nod instead of invisibility. That wasn't alignment, that was a compromise. I declined to re-expand my scope without a broader conversation. Not confrontationally, just matter-of-factly. I'm happy to contribute, I said, but I want to be clear on ownership and expectations, so we're not relying on informal support. The room went quiet, not tense, just recalibrating, because it was now clear that the old dynamic couldn't be restored quietly. Too many things had shifted. Clients had noticed an inconsistency. Leadership had noticed fragility. Colleagues had noticed boundaries. The moment for an easy fix had passed. There was a meeting, one of those carefully scheduled ones with an agenda that looks neutral but isn't. They asked me how I saw my role. I answered honestly. I described the work I did, the value it created, the scope is required, and the mismatch between responsibility and authority. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't reference past slights. I spoke in terms of systems, not feelings. And in doing so, I could see something click. Not defensiveness, recognition. The realization that the problem wasn't recent. It had simply become visible. After the meeting, Mark didn't speak to me for a few days. Not out of anger, out of uncertainty. The dynamic he'd been operating within no longer existed, and there was no way to return to it without pretending nothing had happened. It was too late for that, and strangely, that brought me peace. Because once denial is no longer an option, progress, whatever form it takes, becomes possible. The confrontation, when it finally came, was quieter than anyone would expect. No closed door showdown, no raised voices, no rehearsed speeches, just a conversation that could no longer be avoided. Mark asked if we could talk after a meeting. His tone was neutral, almost careful. We sat in one of the smaller rooms, no screen, no table between us, just two chairs. I think I owe you an apology, he said. I didn't rush to respond. He continued, I didn't realize how much I was leaning on you, or how often I spoke over you. That wasn't intentional. I know, I said, and I meant it. Intent had never been the issue. What mattered was what the system had allowed, and what I had accepted. I should have handled things differently, he added. I thought I was being collaborative. So did I replied. That landed. We sat with that for a moment. This wasn't about assigning blame. There was nothing to win here. The old dynamic was already gone. What I wanted now was clarity. I don't need an apology to move forward, I said. I need alignment. On expectations, on ownership, on how decisions are made. He nodded. I understand. And for the first time, I believed him. Not because of his words, but because the context had changed. The organization had changed. This conversation wasn't happening in a vacuum anymore. It was happening after consequences, after visibility, after the cost of misalignment had been felt. We talked through specifics, how we'd structure future work, who would lead which conversations, how to ensure input wasn't mistaken for support work. It was practical, unemotional, and that was the point. I didn't need him to feel bad. I needed him to see clearly. When the conversation ended,
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.